Hello, and welcome to our discussion today about lessons learned and best practices for housing the care population. Pleased to share some information about best practices related to housing and what's happening on the ground. So let's talk through our agenda for today. So we have three main sections. We have a discussion highlighting resources and technical assistance opportunities that we have available, just walking through some of the resources that we already have. And then we're going to turn to a discussion with on-the-ground examples from a couple different counties and one city, and what they've learned about working with this population. And then we're going to turn to a live discussion that we hosted with some panelists, starting with a brief update on the Behavioral Health Bridge Housing Program, or BB, and then a discussion regarding housing strategies. So some learning objectives for today. We hope that by the end of the session, you will have an increased ability to apply housing system strategies within your counties, identify some challenges, but also possible solutions for implementing these strategies, and then incorporating resources available to help support implementation of county priority programs. So I'm pleased today to be joined by two of my colleagues, Anthony Federico and John Rubin. Anthony is from Health Management Associates, and he's done a lot of work with government and also nonprofit leaders over a decade working with housing and homeless services. John Rubin is another colleague from Health Management Associates, and he has done a lot of work with human services leaders, over 20 years of experience in strategic planning, identifying and analyzing problems, and implementing plans. So I'm going to turn the time over to Anthony to go over some of our resources. Anthony?
Thank you. As Patricia just said, I'm Anthony Federico, and I'm very happy for this chance to share information about best practices and lessons learned for engaging CARE Act respondents in the housing process. On the next slide, we have a few quick words on existing HMA trainings. If you've not done trainings in this series until now, this slide and these links are intended to let you know about what's available on the topic of care and housing. These are fantastic trainings available on the CARE Act Resource Center at care-act.org. And we're going to jump in with a refresher on some of the housing models and best practices previously covered before we pivot to our county presenters. So first, we're going to briefly step back and ask ourselves, well, why is there this CARE Act focus on housing? And the reason is that finding stability and staying connected to treatment can be very difficult for respondents, period. And that's all the more so when a person's experiencing the stressors associated with living outdoors or in a tent or in a vehicle. So to help ensure that the CARE Act process can support the respondent, an individual is going to need housing solutions that are a fit for them, right? And so those housing solutions could include interim or bridge housing, licensed adult or senior care facilities, or housing with family and friends. And the next slide shows a number of models and concepts that might be familiar and that we take a much deeper dive on in those previous HMA trainings, which we encourage you to go back and have a look at. But let's first get refreshed on the housing first model and housing first principle itself. So housing first is a general approach or overarching philosophy that emphasizes housing as a basic human right. People can better utilize services, maintain employment, and sustain recovery when they first have stable housing, and not the other way around. The opposite would be housing programs or models that require sobriety or participation in treatment or absence of a criminal record as a condition of housing. And those sorts of practices are not housing first and have been shown to have a negative impact on health and well-being. Next, there is a growing body of research that shows housing first achieves the outcomes we all want to see. This is one example of many studies that show this, and we go into more depth on it in some of our other trainings. So here we're looking at a number of the major housing program types, which are all very effective and are all a little different. And there's some unique considerations for us when we're engaging CARE Act participants in any of these housing programs. So first, bridge or interim housing is typically for individuals who are highly vulnerable and may already be in a housing process, meaning they have applications pending or are referred to a unit that is just being turned around for them and isn't available yet. So one unique consideration for engaging with CARECT respondents in this sort of program is that it's bridge housing. It's not a permanent housing program, and it's intended to do just what it sounds like, to bridge an individual or household from one situation to that next permanent housing opportunity. So family, friends, providers, and an overall support system need to all begin together planning to transition the individual to stable housing upon exit and to be present to support that transition. Next, rapid rehousing is a well-known intervention that rapidly connects individuals and families who are unhoused to housing opportunities that, true to a housing first model, are offered without preconditions related to employment or sobriety or anything else. The intervention consists of time-limited rental assistance and supportive services or whatever type of case management might be necessary and tailored to the specific household or population. This can often include a vocational component because much of the time, not all the time, but much of the time, the theory with rapid rehousing is that individuals or families can regain employment and regain income, and then gradually over time regain responsibility for fully paying rent. So once again, the unique consideration here for engaging CARECT respondents in this model is that if not connected to the appropriate services and supports, individuals can return to being unhoused. So once again, existing connections to care providers, friends and family need to be part of the support, the housing maintenance support and the transition to the rapid rehousing opportunity. Next, permanent supportive housing, or PSH, is a very well-known housing model that consists of ongoing rental assistance and supportive services that can be tailored to any culture or language or population need. And the rental assistance and supportive services are available permanently as part of the program model, hence the permanent in PSH. One unique consideration for CARECT respondents in PSH is that services are completely voluntary, as they are in all of these housing program models. And if an individual disengages from services, that can put them at risk of negative outcomes and possible returns to homelessness. So once again, the program itself, but also outside providers, friends and families, and other organic and natural supports need to be helping an individual stay engaged with services and maintain engagement with their own housing retention goals. Next, we really just want to convey on the following slide that housing stability is rarely about just the housing program itself. It's about all of these pieces working together to support the individual in their treatment goals and housing goals and whatever other goals an individual might have identified. So these different pieces can include outreach and engagement, which just means meeting people where they're at with a strengths-based and non-judgmental approach, intensive case management, or really any kind of case management that can provide linkage to mental health or substance use disorder treatment services, wraparound services and supports. Case managers can also be a very key resource when landlord issues arise, and extra support can really be helpful in helping finesse or resolve those issues and resolve anything that might be putting the individual's tenancy at risk. Community reinforcement is just a way of describing the benefit of identifying positive reinforcers in the community that will help with housing retention. This can include social and recreational opportunities or job skills training. And peer supports, which is another very effective evidence-based practice that consists of people with lived experience of homelessness or a mental health services system using their unique lived experience to connect in very effective ways with the individuals. And this can consist of advocacy, emotional and very practical support, validation, and more. And peer support in this model has been proven to help clients obtain improved outcomes in treatment, housing, and other domains. So next, we've got a few images of recent site visits that the state conducted to different counties who have already implemented CARE and different innovative housing programs that they've each launched using behavioral health bridge housing funding or Project Home Key funding or other sources to launch shelters or housing programs or a whole range of interventions that are all a little different and innovative and tailored to local needs, which was fantastic to see. Finally, if this training leaves you inspired to be thinking about your local housing services and needs and systems, HMA wants to be a TA resource for you on that. So we have a unique TA work stream related to the housing components of CARE Act, and you can access links, which will lead you to this one-pager. The one-pager shows just some suggested projects or quote-unquote TA offerings that we want to make available to you. And, a couple of these include housing resource gap and opportunity analysis, further orientation to the funding sources and programs available for CARE Act implementation, and other needed TA supports as identified locally. So with that, that was our refresher on why there's a housing focused in the CARE Act work in the first place. We looked at the housing first general approach and some of the major housing program models that we're all encountering in our work to house and better served CARE Act respondents. And then we wanted to raise awareness about ongoing TA opportunities for your housing work in your CARE Act efforts. Now, with that, to introduce our county presenters and county spotlights, I want to turn it over to my colleague, John Rubin.
Thank you, Anthony. And we are going to transition to county spotlights. I'll remind you that our objectives for today were really to help apply housing system strategies within your counties and identify challenges and possible solutions for implementing these strategies. And we really felt the best way to do that was to have you hear directly from counties from Cohort 1 who have begun this work and who have identified some lessons learned. So we've got 3 presenters for you today. Our first presenter is Charlie Newcomb. Charlie is a program manager with the San Francisco Department of Public Health. He'll be followed by Nate Robbins, who is a neighborhood improvement manager from the city of Costa Mesa, and then Marcus Cannon, Deputy Director of Forensics with the Riverside University Health System for Behavioral Health. And you'll be hearing from each of these presenters today, and we look forward to the presentation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Charlie.
Thank you. Good morning. Yes, my name is Charlie Newcomb. I'm the program manager of the Care Court program within the San Francisco Department of Public Health. And just to talk about some of the things we've learned along the way. So I should say the Care Court program started on October 1st. And so we began outreaching to clients identified as Care Court participants and those who have been unhoused. I should say that it's not in San Francisco, we're lucky in that there has been a lot of outreach to these Care Court clients prior to the Care Court even coming into existence. And so for several of our clients, being homeless, being unhoused is not an issue for them. And so it's really learning how to engage clients who know their housing resources, but don't really want to participate in those resources. And some of the things we found is that clients who are actively using. So there are a few issues with that. First of all, just the engagement. We meet these clients out on the street, and sometimes right in front of us. They are actively using. So, it's sometimes difficult to have a meaningful engagement. And so it's really developing the rapport and just saying, I'm wondering, can we have a time just when you're not using? And just so we can have a good conversation. And during some of the times when they're not actively using or not intoxicated on a substance, we're trying to find out what's the issue with housing, like what has been the barriers? And some of them it is, I can't get housing because I'm using. And we really try to educate the client, like, no, we'll take a harm reduction approach. Actively using is not a barrier to housing. And so we're really just helping the client to understand that. And also given that this is not going to be a quick process, given that I need some follow through with the client, and it's just being patient with the process, understanding that with a substance use disorder, things might just take a little longer, and that's okay. And on the other side, working with our providers saying, we think we're ready to go in tomorrow, and then can we push that back a little? We are lucky in that we have good relationships with our housing providers in San Francisco, and they're understanding and they're actually excited about Care Court. And so it's just really meeting the client, especially where the client's at. If they're using, being unhoused is not easy. And coordinating services is going to be somewhat of a challenge. And just understanding that, I think, is really, really important. And also just beginning the harm reduction. I think immediately having that conversation, acknowledging that this is something either they wish to continue or maybe they don't want to use substances anymore, but accessing the system of care isn't always easy. Now, imagine you're not only using substances, so either you're intoxicated or in withdrawal, but you have other mental health symptoms you're trying to deal with. Then on top of that, most people need to go to a specific place to do an intake, to be referred, to be assessed, and finally get into treatment. We try to work around that. So we have access to treatment. If that's something you want, I can get you into residential treatment tomorrow. So just reducing those barriers. And residential treatment is a form of housing. And then after that, you can get permanent housing. So really working with the person, acknowledging all the barriers that kind of prevents them from really getting into a secure, safe place that meets their needs. One of the other things is clients have a history of working with providers, being sheltered, and sometimes that history is re-traumatizing or causes trauma. And so rightly so, they say, no, I've worked with your providers and I don't care to do so. And really just understanding what the trauma is. And that does take a while. So it's really establishing a relationship, establishing rapport, so important. And really understanding what is the trauma and how is that trauma impacting the access to housing. So important. And just acknowledging the client, living on the street, having mental health issues without any medication, really, really difficult. And yet some of these people have kind of navigated that and they feel comfortable. They feel safe in that setting, and we are asking them to leave that setting. So just to acknowledge that and saying, well, what would you need to feel safe inside? And not that I expect an immediate answer, but just to kind of revisit that conversation time and time again. And also one of the things we've learned is there are a lot of providers out there who are going up to our clients. They can feel overwhelmed. So not to just, overwhelm them with providers, like really coordinating, like who's going to visit this client this week and, what day. So whether it's the client's lawyer, whether it's the Care Court clinician, whether it's the peer support. Lots of people involved, but we don't want to overwhelm the client because then they're going to back away. And that comes into the idea that providers can actually cause stress You know a client is getting stressed when they agree to everything, but don't ever follow through. They yes you, so you leave. And so it's really just acknowledging that they're in a difficult situation, and we don't want to add to that stress. We want to reduce it, and we want to make them feel comfortable. So it's really understanding where are they in the process of change. So just having that idea of what would help them to make the next move. What is the barrier that they're not moving? Or what am I not understanding about the current situation that they find valuable? Really, really important. I have a client who lives in a park. He really likes the park, but the other park users don't really like him. And so it's really this understanding what's so special about this place that you don't want housing. And it's really learning that he does want housing, but he doesn't want the housing offered by the Department of Public Health or by the city. And so it's learning, he identified the housing he wants. And so we're getting a little creative. This is one of the lessons learned, that are there other ways that we can offer housing that makes the client feel comfortable? And it's kind of a give and take. I'll give you the housing you want. This is what I'm asking in return. And so it's not the continue of the status quo, but it's moving to a safer place. And so really understanding how could that happen with each individual client, because each one will be different. And we have many, many partners. I will go back. Peer support, so important. Peer support is really important because it informs the clinicians, the health workers at DPH. This is kind of what your client is feeling. Do you understand what it's like to be this client? It really informs how we approach the client. And the client also feels like they have an advocate on their side. If you're going to refer someone to housing, know exactly what the process is. If you say to the client, I can get you in this place tomorrow, that better happen. Your word it should be gold. Clients have been promised many things, and many things have not panned out. So if you're going to make a housing referral, fully understand what the process is, and then explain it to the client. And the other thing is just be creative. So we have a portfolio of housing within the San Francisco city, HSH and DPH, but that might not meet a client's needs. Doesn't mean there's something else that won't. And really begin to explore. And it takes time. I don't know, care court might be, I think, somewhat rushed in that we need to get to a care agreement, and the care agreement needs to be housing. Small steps, small steps. For a person who has been unhoused for many, many years, you're not going to get them into housing most likely within 30 days. It's really figuring out why. Respecting the client where they're at, understanding what their needs are, and then moving forward. So that's what we've kind of learned so far. So I just want to turn it back to John.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. I'll ask, you said a really important quote at the beginning, which was actively using is not a barrier to housing. And I would imagine that you talked a little bit about the engagement process. And I'm thinking you must have built in some strategies to help you get there with folks, whether it's expanded hours or training for staff around engagement. So if you could talk about that. And then there was one question in the Q&A that also said, have you had challenges providing housing for users at the same time as abstainers? So whether it's a specific strategies that you did to prepare to do this, and then have you struggled with working with users and abstainers together?
So the first question, we work in partnerships with other teams within DPH. And so we have shared clients basically. And so we will get a heads up, your client is located at such and such a place. And then we'll kind of get a little descriptor if they're doing good or not so good. No matter what, we always go out there. So we get a sense of kind of the rhythm of using. And so we do a little bit more intensive engagement than our other team members within DPH. And so we get a better sense of when they're not using. There's more opportunity since we have more engagement. There's more opportunity to engage a client when maybe they're not using. And so that's kind of the luxury we have at CareCourt. And the issue, users, non-users, I would just put that off to the side, because if someone just like you offer them housing, we can offer you housing rather quickly. It is not a long process. And they're like, no, no, thank you. Some are very respectful. They don't want it. You really kind of have to take your time and figure out why. What is going on? It could be like, it's going to get in my way of using. I have this special place. When I panhandle, I get a lot of money, and I don't have to go very far to get my substances. Okay, all right. So you want housing within this area. Like, what is it that you think housing is going to get in the way? It might sound odd, but to them who are not that interested in housing, housing is a barrier. Housing is not a positive asset. And so it's really understanding, well, why not? And just being with a client and understanding, oh, okay, I get it. We have one person, she doesn't want to give a certain spot because she makes a lot of money and she has repeat customers per se, that they know her, they give her food, they give her money, and she doesn't want to give that up. And so we're slowly working with her and saying, we're not asking you to give that up, but when it's nighttime and you might not feel so safe. Some of our clients who have auditory hallucinations, it's too quiet inside, way too quiet. They need the distraction of the streets so their voices aren't overwhelming.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And I'm going to introduce again Nate Robbins. Nate is the Neighborhood Improvement Manager for the City of Costa Mesa. And Nate, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John. Appreciate the introduction. And hello, everyone. As John said, my name is Nate Robbins. I'm the Neighborhood Improvement Manager for the City of Costa Mesa. Well, that title doesn't necessarily describe what I do. I manage a team of outreach workers that the city employs. We have a 85, soon to be 100-bed homeless shelter. We have permanent supportive housing, affordable housing in the city. So I manage that system of care. Just a quick note, this is my 17th year in the public sector. I started off as a police officer, so I have a pretty rare experience level with regards to both the enforcement and the service side of things. But beyond that, I don't have any special certifications other than just having done this work and having a huge heart for people. And I think that above all, I mean, we could design the greatest programs in the world, but at the end of the day, the people that we serve and the people that we hire are more important than the programs we create. Our job and the way that we achieve success is by loving people. And so I just want to start off by saying that the more we love, the less we judge, the more success we'll see in our clients and our colleagues and this entire system. So everything I talk about today, it comes from that place that the people are always more important than the programs. So make sure we're hiring the right people and make sure we're loving people unconditionally, and just about anything we do will be successful in that. So as far as Orange County, I'm humbled to provide some information about the entire county of Orange. Again, the city of Costa Mesa is 110,000 people. It's a blip on the radar in the county of Orange, but and of course I'm biased when I say this, but I think we do things extremely well here in the city of Costa Mesa. And so just to give you a quick overview of some of the things we're doing with regards to the CARE Act and CareCourt programs. In general, the general housing landscape of Orange County, I think, is pretty similar to probably everyone else on this call, in that there's not too many different housing options. You have your housing for people that are experiencing literal homelessness. You have emergency housing, interim housing, bridge housing, things like that. Basically, the type of housing that gets somebody off the street, but that doesn't necessarily break their length of homelessness, which is extremely important when searching for permanent housing, right? We don't want to put someone into a housing situation that's temporary, that breaks their length of homelessness, that deprioritizes them for a voucher or some other type of housing option. So, but with regards to, that type of housing, the emergency housing landscape, you can, of course, do temporary shelter. The city of Costa Mesa erected a 50-bed temporary homeless shelter while our permanent shelter was being built. I know the city of Huntington Beach, which is our neighbor over here, has a 150-bed sprung shelter, which is considered temporary because it's not a permanent facility. And then, of course, there are permanent facilities. As I mentioned, the city of Costa Mesa has an 85-bed permanent homeless shelter. There's pros and cons to each of those that I'll get into here in the next slide. You, of course, also have the ability to then have a congregate or a non-congregate shelter or emergency type housing. An example of non-congregate emergency housing would be like what Project Room Key was right around the COVID days, where they would take local motels, give people vouchers to get off the street, to have this, again, non-congregate, this shelter where people don't congregate together. They have their own room, on-site services, all that type of stuff. And then, of course, the shelter that we have here in the city of Costa Mesa is a congregate shelter, 85 beds. There's men's dorms and female dorms, but all the men sleep in the same, they have their own beds, of course, but they sleep in the same space, and the females sleep in the same space, but everybody's together in the same building. And of course, there's challenges with each of those, again, that I'll get to here in just a little bit. The next, I guess, form of housing in Orange County and across the state of California would be these, permanent supportive housing. That's what people get into the coordinated entry list for. They want to get a voucher, whether it's a tenant voucher or a project voucher, so they can move into one of these projects. On-site services, just like Anthony talked about before, which are vital, right? You take someone from an emergency shelter, put them into permanent housing, and then walk away and hope, cross your fingers and hope that they have a positive outcome. The likelihood is that's just not going to happen. We have to continue to serve people, up to 12 months, even farther after they've been housed, to ensure positive outcomes, to ensure that the habits that they've created over the many months that they've been receiving treatment can be continued, and that, again, that they are able to achieve these positive outcomes. And then some other types of housing would be, of course, psychiatric, what I would call specialized residential programs. Some of these will break, someone's length of homelessness, so we just need to be careful when we do refer people into specialized treatment facilities. Things like psychiatric facilities, which, as we know, many years ago, the majority of those were discontinued, which is, I believe, contributed a little bit, at least, to our current homelessness crisis. Crisis stabilization units, which became popular here in the past decade, are typically not overnight facilities, but some of them are. So, when someone's having a crisis, someone can intervene and get them to a place where they can spend the night and level out. And of course, we have inpatient detox. We have a local hospital here that does inpatient detox. We have inpatient detox residential facilities as well. And then beyond, once someone, is out of that detox phase and they want to get into the more residential rehab, there's plenty of residential rehab facilities here in Southern California and even in Costa Mesa. So outside of the housing landscape in Orange County, I did want to go over some lessons learned, some things that we are implementing here in Costa Mesa and throughout Orange County. I think one of the, something I want to say just really quickly is there's this, it kind of goes along with NIMBYism, and that, people don't want necessarily to see homeless people everywhere, but they also don't necessarily want the solution in their backyard. There's this concept that the care court system is going to bring mentally ill and substance, people with substance use disorder into our neighborhoods. That couldn't be farther from the truth. I call that the field of dreams misconception. It's not if you build it, they will come. It's the people are already here, right? The people that me and my team serve, both in outreach and at the shelter, are already struggling with mental illness, are already struggling with substance use. And if we don't have the facilities and the services to accommodate them, then we're essentially not serving them at all, right? Giving them shelter, but not addressing the probably the two major things that are keeping them back from living a life of sustainability is mental illness and substance use. And if we don't have services and treatments for that, we're not doing what's best for the people. So building or developing infrastructure for people with SMI or SUD will not bring those populations into your areas because they're already there. We need to create this infrastructure to serve the people that struggle with those things in order to help them achieve positive outcomes. So with that said, one of the main approaches that we take here in Costa Mesa and Orange County, I won't take credit for. There's a really great training that Dr. Catherine Warburton gave, who's the medical director of all state hospitals here in California. It was entitled "Why We Should Care," and essentially she outlined this three-pronged approach. Now, whether you want to use a prong or a stool, I think she called hers a three-legged stool. But whether it's a prong or a stool, it's all the same concept. It's this idea that there's three things that we can do as counties and cities and providers to really provide this intensive case management and level of service that our clients are going to need. And it involves three things: medication, services, and housing. Housing is kind of the main crux of what we're talking about here today and the different options. Varying types of housing is so important, just like the last speaker, Charlie, talked about getting creative with different types of housing, making sure that the housing's low barrier. So yeah, different types of housing, the different services, making sure we're wrapping around people, filling all the different kinds of gaps for the different types of things that they might need to progress. And then medication, antipsychotic medications, anti-addiction medications are very, very important to have involved. Just really quick, the city of Costa Mesa was awarded a $4.5 million behavioral health bridge housing grant, BHBH, which serendipitously we'll be hearing about here in just a few minutes. The city is utilizing that $4.5 million to add 15 behavioral health beds to our currently 85-bed congregate shelter. It includes, of course, all the different services that we would need to serve that, the SMI, SUD population that are eligible to receive these services. In addition, it also pays for a full-time outreach worker with expertise in SMI and SUD. So city's super excited. We did, compare and contrast the difference between congregate and non-congregate shelter. I think like most cities had some experience with non-congregate shelter in motels with programs like Project Room Key that happened right around COVID, and then just COVID in general, the basic COVID isolations that we were having to do for our shelter guests that were contracting COVID and they needed to be isolated. So just really quick, going over some pros and cons for the non-congregate shelter. Of course, it's the building's already there. So you just do a master lease on some of the rooms. You can bring the services on site, which is great. You can provide 24-hour security. Each guest has some really good privacy. They basically have their own room, so that's good for them. And then the ability to pivot. So you master lease the motel rooms, and then when you're done with the program, you can cancel the lease and move on. Of course, there are some negatives, though, of the non-congregate. Lack of oversight. We found that when we put our clients into motel rooms, while they had privacy, it allowed them to conduct some, illicit behavior that we wouldn't normally allow in a congregate shelter setting. So lack of oversight. The site itself is unsecured, so there's people that are able to come at all hours of the night because there's no fence around a motel. So the fact that it's unsecured it can be a little bit of an issue. And then along the same lines, the outside influences, so people can come on site and potentially affect our clients. And then so the pros and cons of the congregate shelter, of course, you can do either a permanent or a temporary facility. Ours is permanent, but we did have a temporary initially while the permanent was being built. Services are also on site. There's also 24-hour security, but it is communal living, and that's not always for everybody. And then because it's a permanent site, it's difficult to pivot. So if the need goes away, now you have this shelter, and there's not really much, it's hard to pivot from that. Of course, as we know, shelter is not for everybody, especially congregate shelter. It's very expensive, and then there's limited capacity. Whereas if a motel runs out of rooms, you can just sign another master lease and you have more rooms automatically. But our shelter is 85 beds, and that's the max capacity. So that's a quick overview. I hope I didn't take too long, but I'll kick it back to you, John. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Marcus Cannon. Marcus is the Deputy Director of Forensics for Riverside University Health System, and he's going to tell us about the housing work happening in Riverside County. Marcus?
Thanks, John. I appreciate this opportunity to be here and to share. As John mentioned, I'm the Deputy Director with Riverside University Health System Behavioral Health over our forensic services, which houses Care Court as well as other collaborative courts. Additionally, our forensics team oversees our Public Guardian's Office and our housing and homeless programs. So I feel fortunate to get to supervise our Care Court team as well as our housing and homeless programs, given that there's significant overlap there. Riverside University Health System is the county behavioral health department here in Riverside County. We're an integrated system. Also under the RUHS umbrella are housed our county medical center, 13 federally qualified health centers, as well as our behavioral health department, our public health department, and our correctional health services in our jails and juvenile halls. Just to lay the groundwork and set the stage a little bit about where we find ourselves in Riverside County, we were obviously a pilot 1 county. We're really fortunate that we have significant behavioral health investment in housing already, and we've had that for a number of years, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We're also fortunate we have a robust homeless continuum of care here in Riverside County that's led by our Housing and Workforce Solutions Department. That, I think, is definitely an asset for us as we look to make sure that we're able to meet the housing needs of Care Court participants. One of the challenges is geographically, we're a very large county, 7,300 square miles. We're a long, narrow, Tennessee-shaped county. You can drive for 3 hours in one direction and still be in the same county. So covering the entirety of that geography is one of our operational challenges. We have 2.4 million residents, and we're the fastest growing county in the state. So those are certainly, and we're generally speaking not an affluent county, so those are challenges. And I would say in terms of our housing options, we have good breadth. We have some of essentially every type of care, but there's more depth that we want to develop where we may not have as many beds as we would like to have in quite a few of those different service types. So I think that's where we're coming from. Under the challenges and strategies that we've encountered, I think capital funding is always a challenge. New construction is certainly expensive. Rehabilitation is expensive. So we're continually going after every dollar that we can to try to meet those needs. We were very successful with the No Place Like Home program, and we're grateful to the state and HCD for those investments. As a county, we drew down approximately $81 million in No Place Like Home funding. But as any county who is significantly dug into doing new capital projects knows, it really is very expensive as a per door cost at almost any type of housing setting. So we're looking forward eagerly to the future with the bond to see what that brings and to see what additional opportunities there will be. But there's certainly ongoing capital need. I think political support is always one of the challenges. It's relatively easy to get political support to say that there's a need for behavioral health facilities, behavioral health housing, behavioral health settings. It's a little bit harder to get the political support for someone to say that they want that facility or that housing or that setting in their backyard. So there's an ongoing need for investment in relationships with our municipalities and our electeds, and to be responsive to their needs and to work through those challenges when there's friction that arises. Operating revenue, again, I think is another challenge. The housing settings vary. At service-based housing settings, there may be an opportunity to bring down Medi-Cal revenue. We're significantly trying to build out our community supports offerings as we partner with our managed care plans to have additional revenue streams that might bring in revenue in housing settings where there hasn't previously been revenue. And then there's settings that are pure housing without any service offering that, again, are complicated to line up and pencil out the long-term revenue. So another area of focus for us. And then I think the last challenge that I would highlight is here under this bullet point. This is master of one, not jack of all. Most people are familiar with that saying. What I think that has meant to us is we have quite a few housing settings that are accustomed to serving a specialty population. Perhaps they're physical health recuperative care that are accustomed to serving those leaving institutions or hospitals with a skilled need. We might have a residential substance use disorder setting that has a specialty in addiction treatment. We might have a mental health urgent care or crisis residential treatment who has a specialty in stabilizing individuals in the midst of a mental health crisis. What we don't have as many are settings that are specialists in all three of those things. And so as we see comorbid and trimorbid clients who have a skilled healthcare need, a mental health need, and a substance use need all at the same time, we're much more limited in the number of settings that can take someone who has all three of those barriers. So I don't think that will be foreign to other counties. I think a lot of folks are probably facing similar limitations, but that's one thing that we've recognized is the need to build out settings that are really equipped to serve people who have multiple barriers like that. I think that segues well into this lessons learned section. Our biggest lesson learned as a cohort 1 county is start early. Many of you are probably familiar with the old adage that says the best day to plant a tree is 20 years ago and the second best day is today. We were fortunate that we started over a year early in our planning process, and we had various levels of committees working on that planning. Committees at the county executive level, kind of at the department head level, the managerial level, the boots on the ground level. And it took every bit of that year to be ready. So that's one lesson we would certainly want to share with other counties. We have a number of pretty successful partnership meetings where we as the behavioral health department will lead and facilitate the meeting. And then we'll have municipal partners, city partners in the meeting, partners from the Board of Supervisors office, nonprofit, NGO, CBO partners, law enforcement partners, and other stakeholders as appropriate. And we use these partnership meetings in many different sites and settings, but especially if there's anywhere where we have a concentration of county services or a core issue that we're trying to address. And I think that's been helpful to us in building collaborative partnerships, building goodwill, paving the path for green lighting, citing future projects. Those meetings are not always 100% comfortable, right? Different partners come together and have different viewpoints and sometimes have to hash out points of friction. But being an accessible and available partner has been helpful and valuable to us in getting support from other municipalities to be able to move forward additional projects. So I think that's a lesson that we would want to lift up. I know sometimes there can be a temptation to feel that transparency equals scrutiny, and any new transparency leads to additional scrutiny, but we've seen fruit be born of those efforts. And then the last lesson that I would want to highlight is there certainly is a need for low barrier housing settings. Many of our care court participants who are homeless are coming to us with trimorbidities, as I mentioned, and they may need all three of those services, the physical health, the mental health, the substance use, and a number of our housing settings need people to have one or more of those barriers under control. For example, we might have a mental health care setting that's not set up to manage the physical health, et cetera. So that's certainly a need that we've known before, but Care Court has continued to highlight that to serve our unhoused population, there's a need for true low barrier settings, low barrier but high resource settings that can meet multiple needs. I think that's what I would want to highlight on this slide. If we could go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned before, we are very fortunate in Riverside County that we've had a lot of investment into multiple different setting types. And so what you'll see highlighted on this slide are a number of the different settings that we've used for Care Court participants thus far. We have a series of mental health urgent cares that are spread throughout the county. We have one current sobering center. It has 15 chairs. People can stay at the sobering center for up to 24 hours. While they're at the sobering center, the crux of the service is meeting with a drug and alcohol counselor who will work with individuals using motivational interviewing to try to get them to take that next step and be willing to go into residential substance use treatment. And we're seeing a really high conversion rate of people coming into sobering center being willing to take that next step and go into residential substance use treatment. Part of the enticement to come to the sobering center and to stay at the sobering center for that 24 hours is that we also help people meet some basic needs. People can do laundry while they're there, take a shower, get a meal, charge their cell phone. And that enticement is critical in keeping people there, but the crux is meeting with that drug and alcohol counselor as well as a peer support specialist to try to convince people to be willing to take the next step. We have a number of emergency shelters, mainstream, traditional, congregate shelters that we work with. Additionally, there's some bridge housing shelter partners in our county. We were one of the early DMC ODS counties, and so we've got a really strong residential substance use treatment continuum here in our county, despite the fact that the qualifying diagnosis for Care Court is a psychotic disorder. We see a very large percentage of our clients that we've received as petitions who also have a co-occurring substance use disorder. And so for a number of clients, residential substance use has been an important first step in their Care Court journey. And then we do have sober livings that we contract with as a step down for people leaving residential substance use disorder treatment. These have all been important because so many of the individuals who've come to us, specifically unhoused individuals who've come to us, have come from the streets, have had a co-occurring substance use disorder. And so we've needed things like emergency shelter and bridge and mental health urgent care, really for that kind of day 1 through day 14 to get people in the door. And then there's been a need for residential substance use disorder treatment, not just to meet a housing need, but to meet the clinical need for that substance use treatment. And then the sober living helps give us a longer runway that as people are leaving residential substance use disorder treatment, there's a place for them to go. Once people are in sober living, what's not on this slide is that we're working with our local coordinated entry system and the continuum of care that I mentioned earlier to get people on our community queue and to get people referred for longer term type housing situations, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing. The challenge there, I think, is those waiting lists are longer and that there are not as many slots. I mentioned the No Place Like Home earlier, and that's been a huge boon to our county, but certainly there's still more needed in the way of rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. And then on a different track, we see a number of Care Court participants who may not be fully ready for rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing. And I say that carefully. Our rapid rehousing and our permanent supportive housing do operate off of a housing first model, but we have participants who the severity of their schizophrenia or psychotic disorder lends itself to them wanting and needing the types of supports that an adult residential facility, a licensed board and care would offer. We're in the process of building a new 81-bed adult residential facility that will expand our board and care capacity, but there's certainly a need for additional board and care beds in the county that we're, as I mentioned before, looking forward to the bond and looking to any other revenue source that we can help find to cover both the capital cost of new board and care beds and the ongoing operating cost. So I think these have been the most important housing types to meet the needs of our clients up front, but there is still further investment needed for those longer term housing options for our participants. I'm hopeful that this has been helpful. I know it's a quick down and dirty crash course into what we're doing here in Riverside County, but I appreciate the opportunity to share with everyone. And I'm certainly open to further conversation if there's anyone who wants to reach out. John, thank you again to you and the team and the opportunity to share a little bit about what's been happening here in Riverside County.
Thank you so much, Marcus. I do want to maybe elevate one point that you had talked about, because I heard you say when you were talking about the case studies and the work in the county, you used we a lot. And one of the phrases that you used earlier was that you were an accessible and available partner. So it feels like of all the lessons, even though it wasn't always easy, you mentioned maybe it wasn't always easy and there wasn't always agreement, but being an accessible and available partner and thinking about it as a partnership context may have been the most important thing of the lessons you were sharing. I just wanted to see if you agreed with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Our executive team within behavioral health, I think, would second that. And then even as a county as a whole, our county leadership has been trying to work on integrated service delivery, and instead of offering services within silos, say, what is it that our constituents need, and have our service delivery be constituent focused. And I think if we're not accessible and don't think of ourselves as a customer service department, then it's hard to be constituent focused. So I would agree with you, and I think that transparency hopefully has been helpful to our success and will be helpful to our continued success.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists, Charlie Newcomb, Nate Robbins, and Marcus Cannon, for sharing your challenges and lessons learned as Cohort 1 counties. And with that, I want to pass it back to my colleague, Patricia. Patricia?
Thank you, John, and thank you to our panelists. Just to wrap out this portion of the training, just wanted to quickly review our objectives for today's training session. The goal is that by the end of the session, you will have an increased ability to apply some housing system strategies, identify some challenges and possible solutions, and incorporate some of the resources available in your county to support implementation of priority programs. Now we're going to turn to a live discussion that we had, and this was an open forum discussion that we had a variety of panelists, some of which joined us for the training portion, and plus a couple additions to talk about some of these lessons learned and best practices and what that looks like on the ground. In this panel discussion, like I said, we were joined by Marcus, Nate, and Charlie at the top, who shared with us examples of what they've learned and some case studies of what it's looked like. And then we were also joined by a few additional panelists, Deb Werner, to speak to updates in the BB housing program, Jason Robinson, who is with a housing provider out of LA, and then Dr. Maria Funk to speak to her experience providing housing services in LA County. So now we'll turn to that live open forum discussion. Thank you.
But I'm just going to briefly give you a little bit of background about the Behavioral Health Bridge Housing Program. I think we've called it an update, and the reason why this is being included, really, I'll start with that, is that the Behavioral Health Bridge Housing Program is aligned with the Community Assistance, Recovery, and Empowerment Care Program that you all are here to think about. And care program participants must receive priority for the BB housing program. So the two really do go very closely together. Just kind of a footnote, this is the Behavioral Health Bridge Housing Program. So it's written BHBH, but we all call it BB. The H's are silent. And it was signed into law in September 2022 under Assembly Bill 179 to provide $1.5 billion of state general funds to county behavioral health agencies and tribal entities to address the immediate housing and treatment needs of people experiencing homelessness and serious behavioral health conditions. So really focusing in on a very specific population that the CARE program also specifically addresses. And the funds went to the Department of Healthcare Services and then goes to county behavioral health agencies and tribal entities as a way of kind of folding in and addressing a population that often isn't able to be fully served through just traditional housing channels. The Department of Healthcare Services contracted with Advocates for Human Potential to serve as the administrative entity. And then we also partner with Aurora Health Group, Home Base, Native Americans for Restorative Stewardship, and Perch Projects to also support the BB program. So in terms of an update, round one of BB was awarded to 53 different county behavioral health agencies last year. We think that there are 3 others that are also coming in for about $900 million. And I'm just going to talk about, we kept the BB program very flexible in terms of some of the ways those funds could be used, again, to address those immediate housing needs of people. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit of what we're seeing with that. For that round one funding, and it's kind of fun because there's new programs and new things launching really every day now. It's great to see some of the slides and presentations of the counties that are here. 47 counties are using funds for shelter and interim housing. So in addition to some of what you've seen from Orange County, Sacramento has their Safe Communities program with 80 tiny homes. Fresno is using a motel model with Sierra Sunrise with 60 and Phoenix Landing with 105. Kern County has 39 modular units. And the types of shelter and interim housing, sometimes it's motel based, sometimes it's congregate, sometimes it's recovery housing, or low barrier recovery housing. We do want to make sure that there is housing first and low barrier available in all communities. So 47 counties, I'd say, are focusing on shelter and interim housing. 31 counties are providing some form of rental assistance. And really, you could think of the rental assistance as coming in 2 different ways. One is a more of a traditional rental assistance program specifically for this population with short and midterm rental assistance, where individuals have a unit and sometimes it's shared, it can be families. And then rental assistance is provided to help them be able to stay in that unit. We also, housing navigation has to be provided for all BB program participants to help people to be able to remove barriers and access housing. And then the other approach that we're seeing a lot of is master leasing to help people be able to more immediately move into housing. The BB program also allows for counties and tribal entities to include landlord outreach and mitigation funds, which helps remove some of those barriers and make landlords willing to work with the population that the BB program serves. 31 different counties are providing housing through auxiliary funding and assisted living. And those counties really range from small counties like Amador to San Diego County that are providing housing through licensed facilities, and participants there as well receive the housing navigation to help be able to move into lower levels of care as needed. And then 34 of the counties include some startup infrastructure. The BB program is not designed to be a construction project to build new units, but there is some startup infrastructure available to help get the operations and to get people into housing quickly. And we're starting to see, as I mentioned, some of those programs opening. And then 19 of the counties also include some outreach for the BB program. Part of what Charles was talking about yesterday in San Francisco, really working with people where they are to help them be able to access bridge housing and stabilize. Sometimes they're already in other kinds of emergency shelter, but they fall out of that shelter because of their behavioral health concerns. So really being able to provide those supports to help people engage. And as I mentioned, all of the behavioral health program participants do receive housing navigation. That is a requirement of the program. There is also, some counties have made available participant assistance funds through the BB program to help remove barriers. And voluntary supportive services that don't supplant other funds BB funds can also be used to support those. But we're also seeing a lot of counties that are linking behavioral health bridge housing programs with the supportive services people need provided through other funding sources, including ECM and other mental health block grant and other funds such as that. So that's round one. We do have a total of 4 rounds of funding for BB. Round 3 has recently closed and offers $265 million additional funds for round 1 counties. We've received 38 applications, and these awards will go out in July 2024. Then round 2 provides for planning and implementation grants for tribal entities. It was first issued last year, and $30 million was awarded for 9 agencies I think it's 3 for planning and 6 for implementation. We recently also had a first round of 2B, and we do expect that all of those available funds will also be awarded. We got a good turnout for that round 2. And then round 4, we anticipate for $235 million coming out next year. So just to kind of follow up and summarize, the focus is on the immediate housing needs, particularly while some of the other housing investments in the state of California are being built, and that includes a lot of permanent supportive housing. The BB program is scheduled to sunset June 30th, 2027, so it's really a bridge to address those immediate needs. And it provides a really important resource for the CARE program because housing is such a key social determinant of health. And we know that homelessness exacerbates mental health symptoms, substance use, and makes it much more difficult to engage in health and wellness activities. It also continues to perpetuate trauma and acute trauma. And then the last thing that I just want to close with that kind of ties, I think, a lot of this together, we really encourage communities when you're creating your behavioral health bridge housing, but also across all of our services, the importance of paying attention to the 4 Ps. And there's 4 Ps for different things. There's 4 Ps for marketing. There's 4 Ps for a lot of different things. But the 4 Ps for really addressing the needs of people who are experiencing homelessness are place, people, pets, and possessions. So these are the reasons why people often choose not to leave where they are and move into different kinds of housing services that are available, is because they want to stay where they are. The place is very important. They have people that they care about and access to those people that really serve as extended family or partners. And oftentimes when we try to move people, we say, but you have to leave that behind and come this way. So thinking about how that's a barrier. Pets, and I know a number of the different bridge housing programs are accommodating pets and bringing pets in as resources because pets for many people are family. And then possessions, are they able to make sure their possessions are safe and giving them that sense? Because if you think about what you get out of home, it's that safety, that nurturing, that grounding, as well as the determination of so many other things about like where you can access services, what you can go, what your options are, where your kids go to school. So really being able to pay attention to place, people, pets, and possessions as you're thinking about where people are going to be placed so that they can be successful in their bridge housing as well as their care program. Because without having the access to housing, it's going to be very difficult for people to be successful in care. And with that, I will close and open it up for any questions that people may have.
We'll pause quickly if folks have questions specific to Deb. Remember to use the Q&A feature. Deb's going to be with us, so if questions come in later, I'm sure Deb will be available to help answer that, but just wanted to pause for a minute to make sure there weren't any specific questions for Deb.
All right, and Samantha put the website for the BB program, which has just about everything I said is also available on that website.
Deb, we had a question earlier about if any counties have utilized the assisted living waiver program for care patients who need assistance with caring for their basic needs. Are you familiar with that? And did you have any thoughts on that?
I would defer to the people who are working directly on the CARE program for that answer.
All right. Well, thank you for your presentation and for that information. And we are now going to open this up to the larger panel for discussion. And I'm going to call on my colleague, Anthony Federico. Anthony, I think you have the first question for the panel.
It's good. Thanks, John. So to continue our moderated panel discussion, I wanted to circle back to a question that was posed in the Q&A yesterday, and we were thinking that this could be a good fit for you, Dr. Funk. The question was about transitions. It's well known that transitions can be very challenging and present risk, particularly for people with complex needs. And we want to ask you about how to best support those transitions, particularly when we're talking about the transition from homelessness to housing. Is there anything you've learned or any best practices that you can share with attendees here today?
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that question. I think actually Deb really kind of addressed that question regarding the 4 Ps, but I can elaborate on that. So to give a little bit of background, in LA County, we started our Care Court program on December 1st. And I think regarding the Care Court population, kind of by definition, there have been challenges already, probably in outreaching and engaging the people that are served in Care Court. Care Court serves people that really haven't been successfully engaged in treatment, and that's why someone is doing a petition to refer them to Care Court. So I asked our team that is providing the services. So I oversee our housing resources for our department. And we have been working with our Care Court team as they have worked on getting ready to implement their program, talking about workflows on how they will refer people into our existing housing resources that we have. We did apply for BHBH and did get a grant, but we haven't started those programs yet. So what our teams are going to be accessing are our existing interim housing, our existing what we call our enriched residential care program, which is where we provide subsidies for people living in licensed residential care facilities. And then we also have permanent supportive housing. So far, we have received in LA County 122 petitions. 45 of those have been for people that were unhoused. I think when we first started the program, I heard about 50% were unhoused, but it looks like it's about 37%. And so we have received for our interim housing program, we have received 15 referrals. And of those 15 referrals, 2 people declined. They decided they didn't want to go into the interim housing. 7 people did not show up, so we reserved a bed for them, but they never made it there. I don't know why, but I think this question is really part of the reason why, that it's making that transition from homelessness into wherever it is, and in this case, interim housing, is a complicated transition for people. 6 people actually did arrive, but 2 have exited since then. So 4 people are still there. We also had 2 referrals into our enriched residential care program, where the case managers are looking for licensed residential facilities for them to move into. And I think really the key in helping people transition into housing, whatever kind of housing it is, really is the constant engagement, constant trying to connect with someone, trying to find a way to connect with someone. And many people have been very disappointed by the mental health system, or they've been harmed by the mental health system. And maybe they've been put on, involuntary holds, or they've had experiences like that have made them not trust, or maybe they've been promised housing and people did not come through. I think someone talked about that on the panel yesterday, like how critical it is that when you're working with someone and you're engaging them, that what you offer them, that how you say you can help them, that we follow through and we actually do that. And I think what I would say is, people that work in outreach have, hiring people that have, skills to do that. People with lived experience often are people that can connect with people. People that have lived experience of being homeless, for example, often have, you know, a great ability to be able to connect with other people and share their story and helping to engage people. So constant engagement, I would say, not just referring people to a place, like say, oh, there's interim housing on this street over there, you know, good luck. Driving them there, to state the obvious. But I think in helping them transition, helping them, you know, get to know who are the people there and making that transition, what we call a quote warm handoff, where the people that have made the connection with the person that are trying to help them move into wherever the housing is, that they work to help make that connection. And for us in LA County, we're having full service partnership programs that are care court specific, serve the clients, and making sure that the team is going to continue to serve the people even when they move into whatever housing that they're going to. And that if one place doesn't work out, keep trying, like don't give up. Like we have to work with someone to find what is the right place. If that wasn't the right place, that did not work for them. I think the issue, Deb, that you said of pets is really important. People are not going to leave their pets behind, and we have to have housing, including interim housing, that can accept pets and that have rules. I worked with in my administrative role, I had a client that emailed me a lot and still does. And he had a dog, and many of our interim housing sites had a rule that the dogs had to have vaccinations, and he would not get his dog vaccinated. And we had the hardest time helping him get into housing. And that was a huge barrier. So I think it's also looking at what are the barriers that we set up that make it difficult for people to transition. I will say eventually we found an interim housing site that accepted pets, even that were not vaccinated, and we helped him move into permanent supportive housing. And of course he could have his dog there, and that was very important to him. So I'll stop there. So thank you, Anthony, for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Funk. I appreciate it. And I recall it was Charlie yesterday who was also really emphasizing this theme of being a reliable and consistent presence in the outreach efforts to engage with this population. And Charlie, you are who I wanted to pivot to next. You yesterday were discussing outreach strategies for engaging clients who maybe had not identified housing as a goal. And when you and I were prepping for this presentation a couple weeks ago, you told me about one technique specifically that you and your colleagues used, which was taking videos of units of apartments and then taking those back out into the field or shelter settings or wherever to show to individuals to try and engage them and show them what housing is and maybe spark some interest or curiosity. So I'd love for you to elaborate on that or any other creative engagement strategies that you think this audience of providers across the county should know about.
Sure. So yeah, some clients just aren't interested in housing for various reasons. And to kind of pique their interest, we want to show them kind of what's in our portfolio, so to speak. And so one of the things we do is we will take kind of a video tour. We'll record the facility, the residents, and then go back to the client and show them. But we also will say, why don't you come with us and take a tour? Why don't you meet the staff? You can ask your questions. And some clients like the basic stuff like, okay, but where do I get my food? You know, where's the nearest bus stop? Just very practical questions. And so it's really helping them to make the choice. They have a choice to make. This is a voluntary program. And so we want to respect that, you know, this is ultimately their decision. And to make a good decision regarding their housing, they need to be informed. And so for very reluctant clients, we kind of show them the video. For other clients, we actually take them to the facility. We inform the facility beforehand, whether that's a navigation center, whether that's just stabilization housing, short-term hotel, or permanent housing. We always take them out there and saying, what do you think? And I should say, it takes a few pitches. clients either will say no flatly out, or they will yes us, but never follow through. And so it's really kind of that engagement, kind of figuring out what's your reluctance and really get a better sense of that. Yeah, and just really working with them to figure out where their needs would be met, and not saying you have to have shelter. I think when you have that type of delivery, it's what are you looking for? What do you want? And just having that open dialogue and letting them know, well, this is available, this is available. They have choices. We have now the tiny cabins, which is relatively new to San Francisco. And so most of our clients don't know what they are. And so we take a tour and we say, you can go into this next week if you would like. And so, we can make things happen quickly. There isn't a wait. And that's the other important issue. You're not on a wait list, because I have a client on the VA Section 8 list, and he's been on the wait list for 3 years. Clients are not going to be motivated. So I think not only is give them choices, but make it happen quickly. So that's been very successful for us.
Charlie, appreciate you especially lifting up the theme of client choice and the way emphasizing choice and options has been a successful engagement strategy for you and your colleagues. Next, I want to move over to Jason Robison from Share Housing in LA. Jason, we had the pleasure of having a conversation a couple of months ago, and we really wanted to be sure to have a housing provider on this panel to share your experiences and perspectives on housing for this CARE Act population. You have done some innovative and creative things with your programs and models in LA, and I'd be grateful if you could share for a few minutes about some of that work and models to this statewide audience.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for being here. If my internet goes spotty, let me know and I'll turn off my camera. I'm in a hotel in Sacramento. So, but I appreciate the discussion. Share is a nonprofit in Los Angeles County. We're a contractor with the Department of Mental Health. And many, many years ago now, it used to not be so many years ago, but in about 2004, we had somebody come to us that was essentially the kind of CARE Act population person who said, I've got all these things and there's no housing for me, and what can we do? And what we did was support her and her goals in finding a housing solution that worked for her, that kind of eliminated the barriers. And to cut to the chase, what that became is basically recovery residences for people experiencing mental health and homelessness issues. So we activate within those. They're single family homes across Los Angeles County. We have about 40 homes right now that have at any given time 300-ish beds. They're 3, 4, and 5 bedroom houses where people live together. Everybody has their own rental agreement with the owner. So we're not building new construction. We're in places where people want to be, and people are managing the house themselves with support from people with lived experience that are trained in peer support services to help them identify long-term goals, short-term goals, manage the house, deal with the conflict that comes up. And conflict will come up. That's a really important thing. One of the things that we see is that the cycle of of homelessness and mental health issues, especially when there's a trauma background, when people don't experience alignment or in an agreement in relationships, we see a lot of people get into fight or flight mode, which makes it very difficult to sustain relationships over time. And so what we're doing in this housing model is really giving people that agency and that purpose when there's disagreement and conflict, with support so that they strengthen relationships, and we connect them to relationships in the surrounding community through self-help support groups that are based on their goals rather than any preset goals. So the important thing about how we consider recovery residences for people with mental health issues and who have experienced homelessness is that recovery is self-defined, and everybody has their own definition, and we'll connect them to whatever they want. So the use of peer support in this, I think, is critical, in that within 2 minutes of engaging with somebody, whoever's having that conversation is disclosing their own lived experience, and it becomes a different kind of conversation where trust is able to be established immediately. And with that, we've consistently housed over 500 people a year on a relatively small budget, less than $2 million, where people maintain housing, are moving forward in their goals. 57% of people get employment. And I'll say that this housing, when Los Angeles was doing what was called the VI SPDAT, the assessment, our housing was created for people with acuity, and the average VI SPDAT score was 10.2, which is categorized as acute. So at the same time, we have people at every score point from 0 to 17. So this has worked for the acute population, continues to work for the acute population, and we're really working now on making sure that other counties across the state understand how this works, can try and scale it themselves, so that we can bring this model elsewhere.
Jason, appreciate you sharing that. Appreciate you being here. And then over to my colleague John for our next chapter.
Actually, I'm just going to be a pass-through. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Patricia Doxey, who is going to really open up the questions for all the panelists in the time that we have left. So, Patricia.
So, we have this group on. We have roughly 20 minutes left. We can always continue the conversation via email afterwards, but wanted to open it up for the group to pop open your Q&A, and you can either ask a question to the whole panel, or if you wanted to follow up with a specific individual. We can start off. I wanted to turn the question over to this group from Roberta Chambers, asked in the Q&A. Deb Warner already provided her response. Thanks, Deb. And wanted to see if the other panelists have something to add. So Roberta's question is, could any of the cohort 1 counties talk about when in the process they may offer bridge housing? Is it at the point of petitioning, before the family person is formally enrolled in care, or at the point of a agreed upon care plan? And she says, in other words, how are counties managing housing resources for people who may not ultimately engage in care? Any responses from the group about that?
I would say in LA County that if someone is homeless, regardless if they get officially enrolled in care court, that we want to help them move into housing. And so from the housing resource perspective, we're agnostic to it, that we'll accept anyone that's homeless into our various housing resources. And I know that, when we've worked on workflows with the care court folks, that, the idea of referring immediately, if that's appropriate, if any step along the way is appropriate. But of course, I think ultimately all of our goals are to help people that are unhoused get into some kind of housing as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Maria. Another question that came up yesterday, and I wanted to pose it to this group as well, is speaking to the types of on-site services and supports that are expected to be part of a good housing program. And you all have mentioned a lot of this in that constant engagement, problem solving. And then a follow-up question is, and how may that impact staffing decisions? For example, having case managers on site, peer workers as well, medical supports or nursing. So the two part of that question is the services and supports available on site and the staffing to reflect that. So I wonder if I might turn to Marcus first to speak to that. So the types of services on site and the staffing that's available to support those services.
Sure, happy to talk briefly about that. I think all the panelists have talked in different ways about this. I think the staffing needs to match the consumer. I know that's a little bit of a truism, but certainly we do see a continuum within CareCourt of how much support people need. Our peer staffing has been really critical to have our consumers in CareCourt be able to talk to someone who can say, I've walked a similar journey to you. I know what this process is like. This is not theoretical or hypothetical or academic to me. I've really been in the court system, or I've really been homeless. I've really managed a significant mental health concern. So I think our peer staff have been important. Our substance use staff have been important. And then, like any high needs population, it is a rich staff to client ratio that we find is needed. And definitely there's a need for support outside of business hours. I think for a lot of counties, right, it's intuitive to staff things during business hours, but sometimes an assumption that maybe staffing can be really lean outside of business hours. And that's generally not our experience serving high needs populations in residential housing. If anything, sometimes it's evenings, weekends when people may most quickly find themselves in crisis. One other thing that I'll add, and then I'll turn it over because there may be other panelists who've got good responses on this. Within Riverside County, we've built out our mobile crisis response system quite a bit. And so we've been able to leverage that as a resource that's not housing specific, but by giving those flyers to our participants themselves, as well as to landlords, and presenting it up front. I think it's about messaging. To sometimes mobile crisis response can sound like punitive is not the right word, but sort of, oh, if there's a problem, these people are going to come and see what the problem is, but rather a lifeline. Dear resident, dear participant, here's your regular FSP worker, your regular peer, your regular CareCourt staff. But if for some reason you can't reach them, this is the lifeline, this is the bat light, call this number and somebody can come help you. And then to also give that resource to property management has helped them, I think, be a little slower to call law enforcement, a little slower to feel like, oh, I have to move towards an eviction for this tenant, but instead to feel like they have a lifeline that they can call. So.
Thank you, Marcus. Deb, what do you have to add on this topic?
Thank you. And I completely agree with everything that Marcus just said, particularly about mobile crisis and 988 and being able to tap in and use the resources which are often available and we don't always think about as being available. One of the things that I think is really important when we're thinking about services is we have a tendency to sort of say a whole bunch of needs and then say, oh, but this is a strength-based program. So tell me some of your strengths. And really, we want to make sure that in the services and what we're offering, that we aren't just focused on, you need this resource, you need to change this, and everything being problem-based, but actually think some about those strength-based pieces too. So the opportunity, SAMHSA refers to kind of 4 dimensions of recovery or wellness, being health, home, purpose, and community. There's 8 dimensions of wellness, 4 of recovery, but that kind of covers the same thing. And really thinking about, if somebody likes to sing, can they have access to a chorus? Having people be able to have activities or spaces to engage in building that sense of community, or transportation to do that if it's not available locally. Having activities, food is always a good piece, but sometimes it's art, sometimes it's having that living room space. Because isolation is a precursor to substance use. Isolation is a precursor to exacerbation of symptoms of mental health. So being able to have some of those strength-based resources, as well as the resources to address mental health and substance use, and making sure that they are voluntary as much as you can, so that you have an environment which allows people to engage and go at their pace, so that housing isn't dependent on your access to services. Or as Tanya Tull used to say, housing should not just be a reward for good behavior, but being able to create that sense of community, those resources for purpose, including employment, and not making the assumptions, oh, these people are not people who are able to work. Starting those conversations, or those ways to build that sense of purpose, reuniting with family, whatever it may be, are often just as important as some of the other services that people are providing. And then the other piece on this, because housing takes so many different shapes and sizes, and we've talked about congregate, non-congregate, large spaces, rental assistance, being able to customize the staffing so that it meets those needs. So it may be that you have an active ACT team resource within your community, so tap into and be able to use that ACT team resource. It may be that you don't have resources for really building some of that experience, strength, and hope, and really need to include a lot of peer service workers. But you also may need some people who can help with immediately addressing some serious mental health symptoms and being able to address. So thinking about what the needs are to create that safe environment for people where they can also grow, I think is really that key message in terms of staffing, and then how you braid all of the funding together.
Thank you, Deb. And Jason, I see your hand raised, and I was hoping to turn to you next.
I'm happy to speak to this. Thank you. And I think those are all great points to move forward with that kind of SAMHSA 4 pillars of recovery: health, home, purpose, and community, and how it connects to the type of staff and what the staff do. The example of peer support specialists, really being intentional about connecting people to that sense of community that's aligned with what their goals are. So I think Deb talked about, it might be connecting somebody to a choir. If somebody's goal is to get their diabetes under control, connecting them to a community-based self-help support group where other people in the community are managing diabetes. What we're looking to do is broaden that social support network across all demographics so that people make friendships and plan specifically for who they want in their support network, not just when it's a crisis, but when they want to go do something fun, who can they call? And if they have as many options as possible, they're going to experience a rich, full life. The other thing that I'll say about that is that, we often think about how many staff are necessary for the number of people we have in a program or something like that. And a critical component of that too is making sure people don't feel watched. We have a peer respite in LA County, for example, and funded by DMH. Thank you, Dr. Funk. And recently we had a situation where usually it's 8 people, but 5 of them had moved into housing. So we only had 3 people, and we had 3 staff on, and we were having issues because that's overstaffed. Those 3 people felt like no matter where they went, there was a staff person watching them. And so we have to be mindful of that too, that speaks to people experiencing independence.
Thank you, Jason, for adding that perspective. We did have another question asked by Nicole Salazar. I'm wondering if any of the panelists have had experience with this. And the question is, what is the experience of cohort 1 regarding clients who don't have a cell phone, even that when they provided, they sell it or lose it or it gets stolen? So Charlie, you were smiling, and I don't know if that's because you have an answer experience, but do you want to go first?
Sure. So we have clients who, due to their mental health issues, do not want a cell phone and don't want to be near a cell phone. They have certain beliefs about what cell phones do. And so the reality is, with the client I'm working with, I say, I will be back on such and such a day at this time in this place. And so it is just old school. I'm going to write it down for you. Here it is. And many clients can get free cell phones, even when they're housed, lose it. So the reality is that consistent, like I have a telephone number, I have a way to contact you. I would say don't rely on that. It is person to person. And I should say in San Francisco, we're 7x7. It's very simple for us. We do not have to travel great lengths to find a client. And within the DPH system, there are many teams that are interacting with the same client. So I can reach out to another team and saying, have you seen this person? And so, yeah, it is a little harder coordinating court dates and appointments, but after a while, you and the client get into a routine. And so, yeah, cell phones, it would be really nice, but it really isn't necessary.
Any other thoughts for the group on that question? I wanted to raise another question, and Dr. Funk, I know you've done some thinking on this question, and it's related to equity. And looking at the population that you serve and all their various needs, what techniques have you employed to better improve equity?
So I would say there's been a lot in LA County, but let me focus related to housing. And so for BHBH, one thing that we did, we've had a directive from the board to really look at equity in all allocation of funding across the county. And so we looked at what I'll call geographic equity. We have a racism, diversity, and inclusion department that works for the county, and we consulted with them, and we did an analysis looking at our current distribution of interim housing across the county, and how we should, and looking at the homeless count and the populations served, and we have done a modeling to look at when we allocate new funding for new interim housing with BHBH funding, where will we try to target to make sure that we have equitable distribution of our resources. And then of course we want to take that a step further, and that is looking at who is getting into our housing and looking at the demographics of our homeless population and ensuring that we are serving people that match our demographic in our homeless population, which in LA County is predominantly people that are African American and people that are Latino. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, we've really looked at equity issues in terms of our interim housing, who actually works. I think we all have experienced challenges in hiring staff across the homeless service system. And so we know that our bed rates drive what people are paid who work in interim housing. And many people, unfortunately, there's been studies that show that many people that work in homeless services are themselves on the verge of homelessness because of the pay. So we engaged in LA County APT to do a study to help us understand, what are our bed rates, what are the actual costs of running interim housing, and how do we increase and address and use kind of a formula to determine what the bed rate should be based on many different factors that drive the costs of interim housing, and factoring in and making sure that we're addressing some of the inequities in pay that are happening in our homeless service system. So those are, and we're doing that across the system, not just at Department of Mental Health, also Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, City of LA, County of LA Investments, Department of Health Services, Housing for Health. We're all working together on that. So that's an example of what we're trying to do to address some equity issues as it relates to our interim housing in LA.
Thank you, Maria. We're winding down on our time here, but wondering if we wanted to just do a round robin, so like a 5-second last piece of advice from our panelists. Charlie, we'll start with you. What's your 5-second piece of advice for the group?
Patience. This is not going to happen overnight, and to kind of stick with the process.
Thanks, Charlie. Jason, what would be your 5-second piece of advice for the group?
Really double down on evidence-based peer support practices and making sure that peer support specialists are part of everything that people are doing.
Thank you, Jason. Nate, what about you?
Yeah, I mentioned it yesterday. People are more important than programs. If we have at the forefront of everything we do to love people unconditionally, the program is secondary. So love people, love people, love people.
Marcus?
continue to invest in relationships with the cities and municipalities where you're going to need to try to cite services and programs and supports in housing.
And Maria?
And I would say maybe similar to that, really collaboration between the service teams that are working directly with the client and then the people that manage the resources to make sure that we're working together. We're trying to reduce barriers. We're troubleshooting when there's problems and when our housing resources aren't meeting the needs of our clients, trying to figure that out.
Thank you. Deb, do you want to close us out with your advice?
Sure. Well, all great advice. I would say ditto to everything I just heard. And then maybe I will add also take informed risks. Don't just do the same thing over and over again. But if you're hearing from people that they really want something, take the risk and try it.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you for the group for joining and for sharing your thoughts. We just got one question in the chat. Nicole will try to follow up with you and get some responses from the panelists as well. I wanted to share a few follow-ups. We have a lot of resources, a lot of trainings and materials on the CARE Act website. So please go there and see if there are any questions. We shared this yesterday, but we have housing and services technical assistance available for counties. So please check that out. You can complete that form to join our listserv. We do have an upcoming training. And then if all else fails, email us and we can find the right person for you to speak with. So really appreciate all the panelists and all the participants that joined and submitted questions. And please let us know how we can help.